Now that you did learn a lot about components, templates, and outputting potentially dynamic data on the screen, it's time to take a deep dive into another important Angular concept and topic. Because in this section, we'll take a closer look at directives. And you will learn what exactly directives are, what this feature is about, how directives compare to components, and what the differences are. And you will learn about the two main types of directives you can use and build in Angular: attribute directives and structural directives. You will learn about built-in directives you can use, and you will also learn how to build your own custom directives. And therefore, let's not waste any time. Let's dive right in, and let's start with a super important question. What exactly are directives? So, what are directives? Well, directives in the end are enhancements for elements you're using in your templates, no matter if we're talking about standard built-in HTML elements or about Angular components. Both types of elements can be enhanced with help of directives. And enhance means that extra behaviors or settings can be added to those elements. For example, you could use the built-in ngModel directive, which you did already see in action earlier in the course with two-way binding. You can add that on an input to make Angular aware of that input. You could, for example, then use it with two-way binding to read the input value and set it, but you can also use it without two-way binding, though you'll learn more about that later in the course in the forms section. The main takeaway is that ngModel here would be a directive. It's not a component here. Instead, it's just there to, under the hood, enhance the input element. For example, with two-way binding or in other ways about which you will learn later in the course. So that's the idea behind directives. And unlike components, directives have no template, because other than that, they're essentially the same. Because in the end, components are directives, but directives with a template. Because components, of course, also enhance elements. They enhance the element you're selecting with the component selector. That can, in the end, of course, lead to pretty much a brand new element being available if you're using the tag selector. But earlier in the course, you saw examples where we, for example, also selected a button which had a specific attribute on it, and we then enhanced that. But we did that by also changing the markup of that button, by adding a template to it to change what's rendered between the button tags. And that's what components are all about. They enhance elements also by bringing their own template, which will then be rendered onto the screen. Directives are almost like that, but they don't have their own template. Instead, they're just there to enhance the properties, attributes, or behaviors of elements, but they do not bring a template. That's what directives are. But that's, of course, just the theory. Let's now take a look at directives in practice, in action, to get a better feeling for them. Now, for this section, I prepared a brand new project, which you find attached. And after downloading it and unzipping it, you should run npm install to install all dependencies. And then thereafter npm start to start that development server. Once you did that, you should see a page that looks something like that when visiting localhost 4200. And in that starting project, you'll see that I already added some components, some dummy components, and also a service, which this demo application here uses. Because this application here is not about the components, we're not going to build components here, but instead it's about directives. And we'll build some custom directives. But before we do that, let's take a look at some built-in directives and let's make sure we fully understand what they're doing. So inside this starting project, which I provided to you, if you take a look at the auth component template file, you'll see that in there a directive gets used, a built-in directive, the ngModel directive, which we have used before in the course to set up two-way binding, which allows us to get the value the user entered upon every keystroke and save it into a value of our choice. In this case, into an email property, which here is a signal, which, as you learned before, doesn't matter though. It doesn't have to be a signal. And then we could also set a new value for email or password, and that would be sent back into the input elements, again with two-way binding. But two-way binding, as you also learned before, is not a feature that only exists for this ngModel thing. Instead, as you saw before in the course, you can set up two-way binding for your own components as well. Instead, ngModel is simply a directive that enhances input elements, including text areas or select drop-down elements, such that they do support two-way binding through that directive. So it enhances those elements, but it does not bring its own template. When we add ngModel on an input here, you'll see that if you inspect that input, the content of that element didn't change. There was no template content rendered into it. What you can see though, for example, is that there also are some CSS classes being added to that input. Some classes which start with ng-, which is always a good indicator, if something starts with ng, that it's coming from the Angular framework itself and not from us. And indeed, I don't have those classes on the input here. So ngModel, besides allowing us to perform two-way binding, also seems to be responsible for adding these classes. Now we'll take a closer look at these classes and why they're added and what they're doing later in this course in the Forms course section. Because in the end, these classes are added and updated dynamically by ngModel on input elements like this to reflect whether a valid value has been added, whether the user has interacted with an input, and so on. For example, if I inspect that password input before clicking into it, you see that it has the ngUntouched class on it. And if I do click into it and then go out of it, you see that that changed and now it's ngTouched. So that's also something ngModel is doing here, besides allowing us to perform two-way binding. Because, as I mentioned before on this slide, you could also use ngModel without two-way binding if you don't need that feature to, for example, still get these dynamically managed CSS classes, which you could use for dynamically styling these inputs, depending on whether they hold valid values and the user has interacted with them. But again, that is something we'll take a closer look at later in this course. For now, it's just important to understand that ngModel is such a directive offered by Angular, as you can also tell by the name, which enhances input elements by allowing us to perform two-way binding or by managing those CSS classes. And indeed, if you take a look at the source code of Angular, which you can access since it's an open source project, you'll see that this ngModel directive does indeed do a lot of things internally. Now, you don't need to understand all that code. It is rather complex, of course, because it is a rather complex directive. But one thing you can, for example, see in there is that it has an input, which is internally named model, but which then has an alias of ngModel, and that it has an output named ngModel change. And that, for example, is why we can use two-way binding on that ngModel directive, because it has these properties which follow this two-way binding naming pattern. And that's therefore the idea behind directives like this. They allow you to enhance elements and add extra features to them, like two-way binding or dynamically managed CSS classes, or anything else you need. Now, ngModel is an example for an attribute directive. Now, why is it called an attribute directive? Because you added like an attribute onto an existing element, and it then changes or enhances that element. It may change properties or other attributes of that element. It may add features like two-way binding. So that's why ngModel would be an example for an attribute directive, and will later also build a custom attribute directive. But attribute directives are not the only kind of directive you have in Angular. Instead, you also have so-called structural directives.